Today I want to talk about something that may be one of the most powerful patterns in all of human history, and once you truly understand it, everything happening right now in the Middle East will start to make sense. The pattern is this: every major empire that has tried to dominate Iran, historically known as Persia, has ended the same way: weakened, forced to withdraw, or eventually broken. Every single one, no exceptions. And today I'm going to make the case, using structural history and game theory, that the United States may be heading down that exact same path. So let's start from the beginning, because history doesn't repeat itself perfectly, but it does follow recognizable rhythms. And when it comes to Iran, those rhythms are impossible to ignore. Let's go back to one of the most famous conquerors in history, Alexander the Great. He swept across vast territories, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and eventually Persia itself. At first glance, it looks like a clear victory. So people often ask, didn't Alexander actually defeat Persia? Technically, yes. But what happened next is what really matters. He died at just 32 years old, and almost immediately, his empire began to collapse. His generals turned against each other, internal conflicts erupted, and the empire he built so quickly disintegrated just as fast. And who rose in its place? Iranian powers. The Parthian Empire emerged and went on to dominate the region for centuries. So the lesson here is simple, but powerful. You might defeat Iran in the short term, but over time, Iran outlasts you. Now let's move to the second case, the Roman Empire, the most formidable military force of the ancient world. For over 3 centuries, Rome clashed with Iranian powers. They planned invasions, they launched campaigns, they committed massive resources. Julius Caesar himself intended to invade Persia, but was assassinated before he could carry it out. Then came Marcus Licinius Crassus. He invaded and was decisively crushed at the Battle of Carrhae, one of Rome's most humiliating defeats. Later, Trajan managed to push deep into Persian territory, but even after initial success, he couldn't hold it. Rebellions broke out across the empire, forcing a withdrawal. Then came Julian the Apostate. He launched another invasion and died during the campaign. 300 years of conflict, and in the end, Rome collapsed, while the Sasanian Empire was still standing. Now let's move to the third case, the rise of the Arab caliphates. This is something many people overlook, because yes, in the 7th century, Arab forces did conquer Persia, at least on paper. But what happened afterward tells a very different story. Persia didn't disappear, it adapted, it absorbed, it transformed. The Persian population embraced Islam, but reshaped it through their own cultural lens. They infused it with their philosophy, their art, their literature, their intellectual traditions. Over time, new Iranian dynasties re-emerged: the Samanid Empire, the Buyid dynasty, and later, the Safavid Empire. Persia wasn't erased, it reasserted itself. So again, the same pattern. Iran is not easily conquered. It absorbs those who try. Now let's move to the fourth example, the Mongol Empire, perhaps the most destructive military force humanity has ever seen. In the 13th century, the Mongols swept across Asia. Cities were erased, populations were annihilated, entire regions were left in ruins. They reached Persia, and yes, they conquered it. But once again, what happened next? They didn't erase Persia, they became part of it. The Mongol rulers in Iran, known as the Ilkhanate, gradually converted to Islam. They adopted Persian administrative systems. They patronized Persian scholars, artists, and poets. Over time, they stopped being foreign conquerors and became integrated into Persian civilization. Once again, Iran didn't just survive, it transformed its conquerors. Now let's move to a more modern case, the Soviet Union. In the 20th century, Soviet forces occupied parts of northern Iran, not once, but twice, during World War I and again during World War II. And yet, both times they were eventually forced to withdraw. In 1946, Joseph Stalin attempted to maintain control over northern Iran. He refused to pull back Soviet troops. What followed was one of the earliest geopolitical crises of the Cold War. And in the end, even a nuclear superpower had to back down, forced out. So now we have a clear pattern, and I want to make this absolutely clear. Iran is not just another nation-state. It is a civilizational entity, a continuous cultural force that has existed for over 3,000 years. One of the oldest living civilizations on Earth, and throughout that entire history, every external power that tried to permanently dominate it has ultimately failed. Empires rise, empires fall, Iran remains. Now I want to go deeper, because this pattern is not random, it's not luck, it's not coincidence. There are structural reasons behind it. And this is where game theory helps us understand what's really happening. Let's break it down. Reason number 1, strategic depth. Iran is not a small country. It's vast, roughly 4 times the size of Iraq, with a population approaching 90 million people. Its geography alone creates a natural defensive fortress. To the west, you have the Zagros Mountains. To the north, the Alborz Mountains. Across the interior, deserts and harsh terrain that complicate any large-scale invasion. History has shown this again and again. There are places you simply don't invade unless you are prepared for a long, exhausting, and uncertain campaign. You've probably heard the warning, never march on Moscow. The same logic applies here. Invading Iran is not just difficult, it's structurally overwhelming. To truly control that territory, you would need millions of troops, not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, millions. And when you compare that to the size of modern Western militaries, the numbers simply don't add up. There is no realistic scenario where a foreign power can occupy and control Iran at scale. None. Reason number 2, the inverted military structure. This is critical to understand. Traditional military power follows a pyramid. At the base, you have infantry, large numbers, relatively low cost, highly flexible. Above that, armored units. Above that, naval power. And at the very top, the most expensive and least flexible, air power. In long wars, especially wars of attrition, success usually depends on the base of that pyramid. Numbers, sustainability, flexibility. But modern Western militaries have shifted away from that structure. They rely heavily on advanced technology, especially air power, highly sophisticated, extremely expensive, but limited in scale and difficult to sustain over time. This creates an imbalance, because in a prolonged conflict, cost becomes a decisive factor. And that leads us to the third reason. Reason number 3, asymmetric cost dynamics. This is where the math becomes brutal. Modern warfare is no longer just about firepower, it's about efficiency. Imagine this. A relatively low-cost drone can be produced for tens of thousands of dollars. Now compare that to the systems designed to intercept it. Each interceptor can cost millions. So every time one side launches a low-cost system and the other responds with a high-cost defense, the economic balance shifts, not slowly, rapidly. Now, scale that up. Not one drone, not 10, hundreds, swarming simultaneously, overloading detection systems, forcing multiple intercept attempts per target. Even when interception works, the cost exchange is heavily unbalanced. And when it fails, the impact is immediate. This creates a scenario where one side is effectively draining the resources of the other, not through direct confrontation, but through sustained pressure, step by step, resource by resource. This is not new. It's a modern version of an ancient strategy. You don't defeat a stronger opponent by matching their strength. You outlast them. You stretch their system. You force them into a position where maintaining the fight becomes more expensive than ending it. Reason number 4, the will to endure. And this may be the most important factor of all, because wars are not decided only by weapons. They are decided by mindset, by resilience, by how long each side is willing and able to continue. Iran is not just operating as a government. It sees itself as part of a long historical continuum, a civilization that has faced external pressure for centuries and adapted every single time. That creates a very different strategic posture, long-term thinking, patience, willingness to absorb pressure. On the other side, modern democracies often operate on shorter cycles, political timelines, public opinion, economic pressure, and that creates friction. Because sustained conflict requires unity, resources, and determination. If any of those weaken, the entire strategy becomes unstable. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Because war is not only fought on the battlefield, it operates across multiple dimensions at the same time: military, economic, political, and informational. And the key difference lies here. Some strategies try to align everything around military action. Others use military action to reshape everything else. And that distinction changes everything. Now let's expand the lens. Because this conflict is not just military, it's systemic. War unfolds across 4 interconnected dimensions: the military dimension, the economic dimension, the political dimension, and the narrative dimension. And here's the critical insight. Some powers try to force the economic, political, and narrative layers to follow their military strategy. Others do the opposite. They use military pressure to reshape the economic, political, and narrative landscape at the same time. And that difference is enormous. Let's look at how this plays out. A conventional approach to war is straightforward. Apply overwhelming force, force a collapse, reshape the political structure afterward. But this model depends on stability elsewhere. It requires a stable economy, reliable alliances, and a consistent narrative that maintains public support. If any of those begin to fracture, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. Now, consider a different approach. Instead of separating these dimensions, you integrate them. Every military move is designed not just for tactical gain, but to trigger economic pressure, political shifts, and narrative consequences simultaneously. That's a completely different level of strategy. Take energy flows as an example. There is a narrow maritime corridor that carries a significant portion of the world's oil supply, the Strait of Hormuz. Control, or even partial disruption, of this route has global consequences. Energy prices react, markets respond, governments feel the pressure, and it doesn't take full control to create impact. Even uncertainty is enough, because modern economies are deeply sensitive to disruption. Now think about what that means. If energy flows become unstable, global markets feel it almost instantly. If markets react, political systems begin to feel pressure. If political systems feel pressure, strategic decisions start to change. This is how a regional conflict can scale into a global one, without expanding geographically. There's another layer to this: selective pressure. Not every actor is affected equally. Some routes remain open, some relationships remain stable, some actors are treated differently. That creates divergence. Alliances begin to shift, interests begin to separate, regional dynamics start to fragment, and that fragmentation becomes leverage. Now let's zoom out even further, because at the center of the global system lies something even more important than territory: a financial architecture. For decades, global energy trade has been closely tied to a specific currency system, and that system has played a central role in maintaining global influence. Because if the world depends on a certain structure to access energy, it also depends on the system behind that structure. But what happens when that structure is challenged? Not directly, not through confrontation, but through gradual pressure, through uncertainty, through instability, through shifting incentives. If key regions begin to question that system, if alternative arrangements begin to emerge, if confidence begins to erode, then the foundation itself starts to weaken, not overnight, but progressively. And this is where the long-term strategy becomes clear. You don't need to defeat a global power in a direct confrontation. You don't need a single decisive battle. You change the conditions under which that power operates. You increase the cost of maintaining influence. You introduce instability into its support systems. You stretch its resources across multiple domains, until eventually, maintaining the system becomes harder than adjusting it. History has shown this before. Major powers rarely collapse because of one single defeat. They decline because the cost of sustaining their position becomes too high, because internal pressure builds, because external commitments multiply, because the system becomes too complex to hold together. And that brings us to the final question. Why is adaptation so difficult? Because changing strategy at this scale requires something rare: long-term planning, institutional alignment, and the ability to absorb short-term setbacks in exchange for long-term stability. Without that, even the most powerful systems can struggle to adjust. Now let's bring everything together, not as a prediction, but as a framework for understanding what may be unfolding. Now let's bring everything together, not as a prediction, but as a framework, a way of interpreting patterns that have repeated across centuries. Because when you step back and look at the full picture, a few things start to become clear. This is not just about a single conflict. It's not just about a region. And it's not just about short-term outcomes. This is about systems, about how power is sustained, and how it begins to erode. Throughout history, dominant powers have followed a similar trajectory. They expand, they consolidate, they project influence outward, and for a time, it works. But overextension carries a cost. Maintaining presence across multiple regions, managing alliances, sustaining economic stability, responding to constant pressure, all of it adds up, slowly at first, then all at once. And this is where the deeper historical pattern comes into play. Empires rarely disappear in a single moment. They don't usually collapse because of one decisive event. They decline because sustaining their position becomes increasingly difficult, because internal pressures begin to rise, because external challenges multiply, because the system itself becomes harder to maintain. At the same time, other actors don't need to overpower them directly. They don't need to win in a conventional sense. They just need to operate in a way that increases those pressures, gradually, consistently, across multiple dimensions. And when you apply that lens to the present, you begin to see a familiar structure, a long-term approach, a focus on endurance, an emphasis on shaping conditions rather than forcing outcomes. This is not about speed, it's about time. Because in long strategic timelines, patience becomes a form of power. The ability to wait, to adapt, to absorb pressure without breaking. That changes the equation. So when people ask, what happens next? The honest answer is, it depends on which system adapts faster. The one that is trying to maintain its position, or the one that is reshaping the environment around it. And that's the real takeaway. History is not just a record of events, it's a map of patterns. And if you learn to recognize those patterns, you start to see the present differently. So don't take any of this as absolute truth. Question it, analyze it, look at the evidence yourself. Because understanding the world isn't about accepting one perspective, it's about developing your own. That's the analysis for today.